Did they make their own clothes? The short answer is yes. For almost all of human history, that's exactly what people did. They made their own clothes, or someone in their family did, or someone in their village did. The idea of walking into a building and buying a shirt made by someone you'll never meet in a country you may never visit is a very new thing. It's so new, in fact, that it would seem like magic to most of our ancestors. To understand how we got here, we have to go back. Way back. Back to a time before looms, before thread, before even the idea of a needle. It all started with a problem. The problem was the world. It was cold. It was hot. It was full of things that could scratch you, bite you, or cut you. We humans are soft. We don't have thick fur or tough hides. We needed a second skin. The first solution was probably the most obvious one. Animals. When you hunted an animal for food, you were left with a skin. It would be a waste to throw it away. That skin could be a blanket, it could be a wrap, it could be a crude piece of clothing. But it wasn't easy. A raw animal hide is stiff when it dries. It rots when it's wet. It's not a comfortable or practical thing to wear, so people had to learn how to treat it. They had to learn how to scrape off the flesh and fat. This was hard, messy work. They used sharp stones as scrapers. It took hours. Then they had to make it soft. They learned that rubbing animal brains or fats into the hide would make it more pliable, and they learned to smoke the hides to preserve them. This was early technology. It was chemistry. It was knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. This was the first clothing production. It was done by hand, with tools made from stone and bone right where people lived. So, for thousands and thousands of years, clothing was a skin, draped over the shoulders. Wrapped around the waist, it did the job. It kept people warm. It protected them. But it was clumsy. It was hard to move in. You couldn't get a good fit. You couldn't run easily or work efficiently while wrapped in a giant, heavy hide. The next big step was a tiny invention. It was one of the most important inventions in human history. The needle. The first needles weren't made of steel. They were carved from bone or ivory. They were small, sharp, and had a hole drilled in one end. This little piece of bone changed everything. With a needle, you could stop just draping skins. You could start shaping them. You could cut pieces of hide and sew them together. You could make a sleeve. You could make a pant leg. You could create clothing that fit the human body. This was a revolution. Fitted clothing is much warmer than a simple wrap. It traps a layer of air against your body, which acts as insulation. This meant people could live in colder climates, they could survive winters better. It gave us an advantage. We could push into new territories, all because of a small, sharp piece of bone. And what did they use for thread? They used sinew from animals. They used strips of leather. They used whatever they could find that was long, strong, and thin. The evidence for this is hard to find. Leather and sinew rot away. They don't last for 30,000 years, but we find the tools. We find the bone needles. We find stone scrapers with polished edges from being used on so many hides. We also have other, stranger clues. Scientists have studied the DNA of lice. Yes, lice. They found that body lice, the kind that live in clothes, evolved from head lice around the time we think humans started wearing fitted garments. The lice needed a new habitat. Our clothes became that habitat. It's a weird way to prove a point, but it's powerful evidence. For a very long time, this was the way. You hunted, you prepared the hide, you cut and sewed it. Everyone in a family or a small group would have known how to do this. It was a basic life skill, like finding food or making a fire. But then came another revolution. It was just as important as the needle. It was the idea of making fabric from plants. This likely started with weaving baskets or making nets. People already knew how to twist plant fibers together to make cordage for tying things or for fishing. At some point, someone realized that if you can weave a flat mat or a round basket, you can weave a flat piece of cloth. The first fibers were probably things like nettles or bark, but the superstar of the ancient plant world was flax. From flax, you can make linen. Making linen was an incredible amount of work. It shows just how much people wanted and needed cloth. First, you had to grow the flax. Then you harvested it. Then you had to rot it. This process, called retting, involves soaking the flax stems in water for weeks. It stinks. It's a disgusting process that breaks down the woody part of the stem. After retting, you had to dry the stems, then you had to beat them with a wooden mallet to separate the soft fibers from the hard, useless bits. Then you had to comb the fibers over and over to get them all aligned. Only after all that work did you have a handful of soft, raw flax fibers. And you still didn't have thread. The next step was spinning. Spinning is the process of twisting those short fibers together into a long, continuous thread. The first tool for this was the spindle. It was basically a stick with a weight on it called a hurl. You would spin the spindle, and its rotation would twist the fibers into yarn. This was a job that took forever. A woman might spend almost all her free time spinning. Walking to the well, take the spindle. Watching the kids, spin. Sitting by the fire at night, spin. It was a constant low-level activity that produced the thread needed for the family's clothes. We find these spindle whorls, made of clay or stone, all over ancient archaeological sites. They are one of the most common artifacts. Once you had enough thread and it took a massive amount of thread, you could finally weave. The first looms were simple, maybe just 2 beams with a thread stretched between them. The weaver would then pass another thread, the weft, over and under the stretched threads, the warp. Over, under, over, under. Slowly, inch by inch, a piece of cloth would appear. This was a technological marvel. You could create a large, flexible, lightweight piece of fabric from scratch. Curbled in leather, it was cooler in the heat, you could dye it. You could make different patterns. So, in the ancient world, whether it was Egypt, Rome, or Greece, did people make their own clothes? Yes, for the vast majority of people, clothing production was a domestic chore. It was part of the household economy. In a typical Roman household, for example, the women were in charge of clothing. It was considered a mark of a good wife and mother. She would oversee the spinning and weaving, often done by herself, her daughters, and her slaves if she was wealthy. They would process the raw wool from their sheep, spin it into yarn, and weave it into cloth on a large loom that was a permanent fixture in the house. The basic garment was a tunic, which was essentially 2 rectangular pieces of cloth sewn together. It was simple. Most people wore wool. It was warm, durable, and took dye well. The wealthy might have linen from Egypt, which was soft and white, perfect for hot climates. Or even silk, which came all the way from China and was worth more than its weight in gold. But even in these great civilizations, specialization was beginning. Not everyone had the time or skill to do every single step. Cities started to have professional weavers, dyers, and fullers. Dyers were like chemists. They had secret recipes using plants, insects, and minerals to create vibrant colors. A certain shade of purple, Tyrian purple, was made from a specific sea snail. It took thousands of snails to produce enough dye for one garment, so it was reserved for emperors and the super rich. The fullers were the cleaners. They would take newly woven cloth, which was greasy and rough, and clean it. They did this by stomping on it in tubs of water and human urine. The ammonia in the urine was a powerful cleaning agent. It was a smelly, unpleasant job, but it was essential. So, a wealthy Roman senator would not have made his own toga. He would have bought the finest wool cloth, which was then taken to a specialist to be cut and draped. But the average farmer or craftsman, his wife or daughter was likely spinning and weaving the wool from his own sheep to make his tunic. The connection was still there. You knew where your clothes came from. They came from your own labor, your own animals, your own land. This model continued for centuries. Through the Middle Ages, the basic system remained the same. Most people were peasants. They lived on the land. They had a few sheep for wool or a patch of flax for linen. They made their own clothes. It was called homespun. The clothes were rough, undyed, and purely functional. You had 1 or 2 sets of clothes. You wore them until they fell apart. Then you patched them. When they were too ragged to patch, you used the scraps for something else. Nothing was wasted, but in the growing towns and cities, things were different. Guilds were formed. You had the Weavers' Guild, the Dyers' Guild, the Tailors' Guild. These were professional organizations that controlled the trade. They set quality standards, trained apprentices, and protected their members. This is where the tailor becomes a really important figure. Before the late Middle Ages, clothing was mostly loose and draped. But new ideas in fashion emerged. People wanted clothes that fit the body closely. This required complex cutting and sewing techniques. It was no longer about just sewing 2 rectangles together. It required skill, measurement, and an understanding of how fabric behaves. The average person couldn't do this. So if you were a wealthy merchant or a nobleman, you went to a tailor. You would buy cloth from a draper, then take it to the tailor to be made into a fashionable doublet or gown. The tailor was a skilled craftsman. His work was a status symbol. This also led to a system called the putting out system. A merchant would buy a large amount of raw wool. He would then put it out to various peasant families in the countryside. One family would clean and card the wool. He'd pay them and take the prepared wool to another family to spin it into yarn. He'd pay them and take the yarn to another family to weave it into cloth. This was a precursor to the factory. This production was still happening in homes, with simple tools, but the process was organized and controlled by a central merchant who owned the raw materials and the final product. The people doing the work were no longer making things for themselves. They were working for a wage, one small piece of a larger process. They were losing their independence. Still, for hundreds of years, making clothes by hand was the only way. Whether at home for yourself or in a workshop for a customer, it was all powered by human muscle. A single shirt represented hours and hours of human labor. From the field to the spinning wheel to the loom to the sewing needle, the amount of effort was immense. Clothes were valuable. People listed them in their wills. A good coat could be a significant part of a person's wealth. And then everything changed. The Industrial Revolution. It started in Britain in the late 1700s. It began with textiles. A series of inventions completely transformed how thread and cloth were made. The spinning jenny, the water frame, the power loom, these were huge, complex machines powered first by water and then by steam. One machine in a factory could spin more thread in a day than 100 women with spinning wheels. One power loom could weave cloth faster than dozens of skilled weavers. Production moved out of the home and into the factory. People left their farms and villages to work in these new textile mills. The work was grueling, dangerous, and paid very little. But it produced cloth on a scale never before imagined. The price of fabric plummeted. For the first time in history, cloth was cheap, but you still had to sew it. For a while, clothing was still sewn by hand, but now, instead of a skilled tailor in his own shop, you had thousands of women and children working in horrible conditions, in crowded attics and basements, sewing clothes for poverty wages. These were the first sweatshops. Then came the final piece of the puzzle, the sewing machine. Patented in the mid-1800s, the sewing machine automated the last step of the process. One person with a sewing machine could do the work of many seamstresses. This combination of factory-made cloth and the sewing machine created the modern clothing industry. It became possible to mass-produce ready-to-wear garments. The first customers for this were not the general public. They were soldiers. It was much more efficient to manufacture thousands of identical uniforms in standard sizes than to have each one custom-made. Then came clothes for sailors, miners, and cowboys. Tough, durable work clothes that didn't need a perfect fit. Soon, department stores began to appear in big cities. They sold a wide variety of goods, including ready-made clothes. At first, people were skeptical. The fit wasn't as good as tailored clothes. The quality was often poor, but it was cheap and convenient. For the first time, ordinary people could afford to have more than just one or two outfits. They could follow fashion trends. The very idea of fashion, which had once been reserved for the rich, started to trickle down to the masses. This was the beginning of the end for making your own clothes. In the early 20th century, many women still sewed. It was still seen as a valuable domestic skill. A woman could save her family a lot of money by sewing clothes for her children and herself. The sewing machine became a common household appliance. Pattern companies produced paper patterns that made it easier to cut and assemble garments at home. But as the century wore on, store-bought clothes got cheaper and cheaper. The quality got better. Women started entering the workforce in greater numbers. They had less time for domestic chores like sewing. It became easier and often more economical to just buy a dress than to spend hours making one. My own grandmother was an expert seamstress. She made clothes for her children. It was a point of pride and a necessity. My mother knows how to sew, but she rarely did it. It was more of a hobby for mending things or making a Halloween costume. For my generation, sewing is a niche skill. Most people I know have no idea how to use a sewing machine, let alone how to spin yarn or weave cloth. The skills have been lost in just a couple of generations. Today, we are at the extreme end of this evolution. Most of the clothes we buy are made in factories on the other side of the world. The textile mills are no longer in Britain or New England. They are in Bangladesh, Vietnam, and China. The connection between the wearer and the maker is completely gone. We have no idea who made our clothes. We don't know what their working conditions are like. We don't see the environmental impact of growing the cotton or manufacturing the synthetic fibers. We just see a t-shirt that costs less than a sandwich. This has led to the phenomenon of fast fashion. Companies can now design, produce, and ship a new style in a matter of weeks. Trends change constantly. Clothes are seen as disposable. We buy more clothes than ever before, and we wear them for a shorter amount of time. We've gone from clothes being a precious resource to being a consumable good, like a paper cup. So, when we ask, did they make their own clothes? We're really asking about our relationship with the things we wear. For most of our history, that relationship was intimate and direct. You put in the labor. You understood the materials. Your clothes were a product of your own effort and skill, or that of your immediate community. There was a story in every garment. The story of the sheep, the field of flax, the hours of spinning, the days of weaving. Today, that story is gone. Or rather, it's a story we choose not to read. It's a story of global supply chains, low-wage labor, and environmental costs. We have gained something, of course. We have gained convenience. We have gained incredible variety and affordability. We don't have to spend our lives dedicated to the basic task of clothing ourselves. We have been freed up to do other things. That is a form of progress. But we have also lost something. We have lost skills. We have lost a connection to the material world. We have lost an appreciation for the true cost of a simple piece of clothing. The answer to the question has changed over time. For millennia, the answer was a simple yes, of course. Then, for a few centuries, it became some people do, but professionals are making more. Then, in the last 100 years, it became not really, it's more of a hobby. And now, for most of us, the answer is a definitive no. I have no idea how. That journey, from a scraped animal hide to a closet full of clothes we barely wear, is a story about more than just fashion. It's the story of technology, of society, and of our changing place in the world.